Please rise. Please rise for the reading of God's Word. We'll be reading from John 9. I will be reading to verse 23, and Betsy will be reading to 24 to the end. Okay, here we go, verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, Is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, It is he. Others said, No, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, Then how were your eyes opened? He answered, The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, Go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, Where is he? He said, I do not know. They brought to the Pharisee a man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. He said to them, He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes? He said, He is a prophet. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight, and asked them, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. His parents said to these things, because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, He is of age. Ask him.
So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, Whether he is a sinner I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. They said to him, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And they reviled him, saying, You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, Why? This is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, Do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now that you say we see, your guilt remains." The Lord bless the reading of his word today. You may be seated.
Well, we are going to be looking at John chapter 9, where Jesus confronts the question, is it more critical that you are blind and you know that you are blind, or that you are blind but you don't know that you're blind? I knew that would happen. There, I think I have it turned on now. So, I think we need to go back to the Van Gogh mount for this microphone. Okay. Let me begin with a small story of what little I know of blindness. In my home, as I was growing up, my mom picked out all my clothes, bought all my clothes, did all the laundry, basically told me what to wear from day to day, even through most of high school. And there was a time when she must have got a good deal on them or something. She bought a whole bunch of socks, okay? They were all identical in weave and weight and everything. The only difference was that some were brown and some were green. And she found that if she left me to myself, I would sometimes wear one brown sock and one green sock. And she would yell at me and make me go change, and sometimes I'd get it right and sometimes I wouldn't. And it was a very odd thing. And then finally, I had to take a physical to go to college, and in that was an eye exam, and I found out that I am red-green colorblind. So I was incapable of distinguishing between, because of the particular shade of brown and the particular shade of green, I could not tell the difference. And of course, there was no other means of telling the difference. So effectively, I was blind in my sock drawer. Okay. So let's take a look at Jesus healing this blind man. Very interesting chapter. As the blind man himself says, never before in the history of the world has such a thing happened. When I read John's Gospel, I try always, first of all, to remember to refocus on chapter 1, which is where John actually introduces Jesus. He introduces him as the Word, Logos, and as the light, And logos is very important. It's Greek. And it was the concept not only of communication, but it was the essence of the divine organizing principle that brought the world into existence and maintains it. In a very real sense, it is God the Creator. I also try to keep in mind Jesus' ultimate testimony, which he gave before Pilate in John 18, verse 37, where he declares, "The reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." So John 1, introduction of Jesus as the Logos and the light. And John 18, where Jesus testifies before Pilate that he is there to testify to the truth. Now, reviewing some of the places we've already been in John, because John is building up a crescendo. For those of you who are not musical, that's a peak. In his book, chapter by chapter, confrontation by confrontation. So back in chapter 5, we see the tension between Jesus and the religious authorities continue to build when he heals the crippled man. And in the exchange with the Pharisees, he calls God his Father. And the Pharisees are angered by both of these events. First of all, Jesus healed the crippled man on the Sabbath. And he told the guy to pick up his bed and walk. And these violated the man-made rules that the Pharisees had put in place to protect the Sabbath. In another gospel, Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. Secondly, Jesus calls God Father. The Pharisees say, he's a man, he's not divine. How can he call God Father? So they consider him a blasphemer. In chapter 6, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, he then declares, I am the bread of life. And in his discourse about that, he confuses many, alienates many, and those who are following him fall away. Not all, but some. Not really the way to win friends and influence people, okay? But remember, Jesus said, I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to testify to the truth. At the start of chapter 7, we learned that chapter 7, chapter 8, probably 9, and the first part of 10 all likely occurred during the Feast of Tabernacles. I'm not going to make your mistake and call it the Feast of Booths. 2 weeks ago, when we were in chapter 8, Jesus said, I am the light of the world, a bold proclamation, which he again proclaims in this very chapter. And last week, he said, before Abraham was, I am, publicly declaring himself to be God on earth. The Pharisees were more than slightly disturbed. So, now in chapter 9, Jesus confronts a couple kinds of blindness. In doing so, he addresses 3 different audiences. First of all, he talks to his disciples. Next, he talks to the man who is blind from birth. And finally, he talks to the religious rulers of the day, primarily Pharisees. And we will see that the man blind from birth has a few things to say in the meantime. So the chapter begins. Jesus and his disciples are walking along, and they see a man blind from birth. I wonder, do you think he had a little sign, blind from birth? How'd they know? Probably because they'd seen him before. And the disciples asked an interesting question. They said, whose fault is his blindness? Is it his sin or is it his parents' sin? Now, does anybody think that's a really weird question? The undergirding assumption is that his blindness is a result of sin. Okay, where would they get such an idea? And then, when we get near the end of the chapter, the Jewish leaders accuse this man healed from blindness of having been born steeped in sin in verse 34. So obviously, this is not an exclusive idea to the disciples. It's obviously a widely held idea. Where would it come from? Well, back in Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, Moses says that God will visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation for those who hate God. So there is a biblical text that says under certain circumstances the sins of the father will be sent down to the children. So they might have picked something up there. Then if we go back to John 5, which I just spoke of, where Jesus heals the lame man, later on that same day, Jesus goes to the man and says, sin, this is in verse 14 of chapter 5, sin no more that nothing worse may happen to you. So by Jesus' own testimony, there can be physical consequences to sin. Then there are in the Old Testament some prohibitions against blindness, which also would probably have some effect on current attitudes at the time that Jesus was on earth. In Leviticus 21, Leviticus is everybody's favorite book. I know it is. Leviticus 21, we're talking about men in the priesthood. They have to be from the chapter of Levi. And it says, no Levite who is blind may enter the holy place in the temple or serve the Lord's altar. So there's a prohibition against the blind. Of course, you have to be a blind priest. And it doesn't prohibit him from service as a priest, just this element of it. He cannot enter basically what we sometimes call the Holy of Holies, and he cannot service the Lord's altar. In Deuteronomy 15, the Israelites are also prohibited from offering a sacrifice that is blind. The sacrifice must be without blemish, and blindness is included in the list of unacceptable blemishes. So, these kinds of things would, since the temple and everything going on there was really the core of what it meant to be a Jew, these kinds of things would likely have affected attitudes about blindness among the Jews. The reply in verse 34 from the Pharisees towards the blind man shows a deep attitude of superiority. We're better than you are. And the question of the disciples has a taint of an attitude of superiority to it as well. Okay? Now, the law does dictate how the Israelites are to treat the blind. In Leviticus 19:14, they are prohibited from putting a stumbling block in front of them. They are not to intentionally cause trouble and harm to the blind. In Leviticus 27, says anyone who misleads a blind man down a wrong course is cursed. This is actually really part of what we call the golden rule. Treat your neighbor as you would be treated yourself, which actually makes its first appearance in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Then there's another aspect of this question. We've been looking at where do these attitudes come from, but the question remains, whose fault is this? How did this person become blind? Well, there are some other things to look at as well. In your bulletin, at the bottom of the left inner page, there is a citation from Psalm 139. And in that citation, the psalmist tells us that God is intimately involved in the formation of prenatal humans and that he carefully plans out their future. In Exodus 4, verse 11, when Moses is trying to persuade God that Moses is the wrong guy to do the job that God wants him to do, and he says, I don't speak well. God says, who makes man's mouth? He says, who makes the seeing and who makes the blind? So God, in that verse, takes responsibility for who is blind. So you have to include God in the equation of whose fault is this. So we've spent a few moments looking at how the disciples viewed the blind man, how likely their culture viewed the blind man. We threw a little theology in there to legitimize this sermon. And now we're going to look at how did Jesus view this man's blindness? Excuse me here. That's better. In verse 3, Jesus tells his disciples that this man was not created to display God's wrath. But he is to be how God displays his grace. Jesus said, we must work the works of him who sent me. He says, this is an opportunity to express the grace of God, and we have to take advantage of it. He says, there's an urgency to this. Time is of the essence. The opportunity will pass. Night is coming when we may not work. While Jesus is in the world, he is the light, and the work can be done. So what does Jesus do? He breaks the Sabbath. He works as a potter. He spits on the ground. I think it is not widely accepted for you to spit on the floor in the church, but whatever. He spits on the ground, makes clay, puts it on the eyes of this man, tells him, go wash in the pool. The man believes Jesus enough to go off and do what he's told. somebody spit in your eye and told you to go wash, what would you do? And he comes back seeing. Now, can you guess what day of the week this is? This is the Sabbath. Jesus is doing his Father's work, even as he said back in chapter 5, verse 17. My Father is working, and I am working. So the blind man comes back from washing. And he's now able to see. This sparks all kinds of debate. Is he who he says he is? Friends, family, acquaintances get in this big argument. Is this really the guy? Now, some say yes. Some say, nah, it just looks like him. And what is it that causes them to even question it? What is causing all this controversy? It's not merely that he can see, but he has been changed by what Jesus has done. He has changed so much that it actually challenges his old identity. He says Jesus did this. They ask how. He says, well, he spit in the ground and put clay on it. I don't know how. He probably heard it. He didn't see it. Where's Jesus? And he says, I don't know. So there's been this undeniable change. This huge thing has happened. And the people just don't know what to do. Now, in the law, it says if you get healed of leprosy, it has specific steps. You go to the priest and you do this and you do that, and then the priest declares you clean, and then because a leper is separated from society, and getting clean allows him to become part of society. Okay, so it's a big, big deal. But there's nothing in the law about a person regaining their sight. And they really don't know what to do. So I guess because they felt the need for some sort of stamp of authority on things, they take him to the Pharisees. And there was probably the element, too, that they knew already that the Pharisees hated Jesus. The Pharisees would want to know anything that was happening that had to do with Jesus. So that's where they go. And back in chapter 8, when we went through that, the Pharisees and Jesus have an extensive debate in which both sides, each says the other side is from the devil. Okay? So at this point, the Pharisees clearly see Jesus as an enemy. And they want to squash any stories about any miracles that he does. So now, having given testimony once before his friends and family, he now must give testimony again before the Pharisees. He tells about how Jesus healed him. At this point in time, this congregation of Pharisees, I don't know which call a group of Pharisees. I know you call a group of crows a murder. This congregation of Pharisees breaks into two factions. Not unlike when Paul is before the Sanhedrin and he says, today I stand here to defend the resurrection, which pandemonium broke out. So they break into two factions. One faction says, Jesus broke the Sabbath. He's a sinner. This can't be from God. The other side says, what do you mean? Nothing like this has ever happened. This is a major miracle. How can you say it can't be from God? And so they're arguing back and forth, and finally they turn to this blind man who was healed. I should give him a name. And they say, what do you think? So this man who 2 hours ago was a blind beggar is now supposed to settle an argument between two groups of some of the most learned theologians in the land. You just never know how things are going to come out. And he says, Jesus is a prophet. Well, at this point in time, the Pharisees come to their senses. This will never do. This guy is siding with Jesus. Jesus is our enemy. So they need to squash this story. So the first thing they do is they start casting doubts on the witness. He was never really blind. He's a liar. We need some testimony here. So they call mom and dad. God the Father shows up in this story, but this is the only human dad that we know that shows up. This is the best I could do on Father's Day. I'm sorry. Okay. And so they ask him, is this your boy? Was he born blind? If he was, how did he get healed? His parents say, yeah, he's ours. He was born blind. But they're afraid that if they choose the wrong answer for that last question, they'll get excommunicated, tossed out of the synagogue by these religious authorities. And the synagogue is like the center of the community. So they'll be ostracized by their neighbors, they'll be objects of scorn and ridicule, yada, yada, yada. So they give them the political answer. They say, he's an adult, he was there, ask him. It's not, they didn't quite throw him under the bus, but it's close. So the Pharisees bring him back in for another round of testimony. This is the third time that this man has to testify about Jesus. The first time before his friends and family, and he just says what happens. The second time, when he gives his first round of testimonies before the Pharisees, he concludes by saying, this man is a prophet. This man's faith is growing with every telling. So, they bring him in, and they say, you need to give God the glory. Now, what they just did is they just admitted this is an astounding miracle. We have to acknowledge that this happened. So we give God the glory for it. But don't praise Jesus. He's a sinner. Now, how do they know he's a sinner? Because he doesn't keep the Sabbath, which has to do with their rules, which is what Jesus talks about in Luke 7, when Jesus says, what can I compare this generation to? He says, you're like little kids in the marketplace playing games. You say, we played this kind of song and you didn't dance, and then we played this kind of song and you didn't mourn, and you're not playing the game. We're setting the rules, we're setting the game up, and you're not playing. And Jesus' point is this is not a game, and that the rules come from God. So they say Jesus is a sinner. And the man who was healed says, I don't know if Jesus is a sinner or not. But I know I was blind, and now I see. So they ask him, how did this happen? He says, I already told you. You were sitting right there. Weren't you listening? And he probably at this point knows, it's very clear, that the Pharisees are envious of Jesus and they hate him. And so he takes a poke at him. He says, why do you want to hear this again? Do you want to become his disciple too? And an important thing happens here. He proclaims himself as Jesus' disciple. He's now firmly, publicly committed to being in Jesus' corner. And there will be consequences of this. The Jews are infuriated. They say, we are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to him. This Jesus is a nobody. We don't know anything about him. Amazing. This man now gives a powerful testimony. He also gives a very good lesson in theology. He says, it's amazing. You don't know Jesus, but he opened my eyes. A miracle like this has never happened before in the history of the world. Now, if Jesus were a sinner, God wouldn't listen to him and wouldn't help him. And if God didn't help him, he couldn't do anything. But we have this miracle, so obviously it has to come from God. And their reaction is so precious. The Pharisees are angry with him, and they slander him. They say, who are you to teach us? What seminary did you go to? You were born blind, and obviously, therefore, born in sin. Going back to the attitude we talked about at the beginning of the chapter. So they throw him out. Jesus seeks him out and asks, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he says, show me. And Jesus says, I'm he. And the man believes and worships. And then Jesus says, I am here to declare God's judgment. What does that mean? He gave the opportunity for spiritual sight to be able to see clearly to everybody. I mean, everybody saw this happen. Everybody heard all the testimony, etc., etc. Some choose to accept it, and some choose to reject it. The blind man accepts Jesus as the Messiah. The Pharisees scorn it. Say, this is a bunch of baloney. He's from the devil. So, Jesus, how does he speak to these three groups? To the disciples, he says, look for opportunities to display God's grace and act on those opportunities because they won't last forever. Jesus says his mere presence in the world, his mere presence in the testimony of men will cause a divide between those who believe and those who do not. Those who believe receiving grace, those who reject receiving condemnation and guilt. The gospel comes to the blind man and he believes. The gospel is displayed before the Pharisees and they scorn. So what are we to do with this old story today? Thousands of years old. Jesus once told his followers, you are the light of the world. How can that be? The Helper, the Holy Spirit promised by Jesus and received first by the church at Pentecost, lives within those who believe and provides Jesus' light so that we may do his work of grace and give testimony of his truth. And we do this because of the great and undeniable change that Jesus has made in our lives. Something that we probably need to dwell on more is the great and undeniable change. Like Jesus also, we are to embrace the blind, the lame, other disabled people. God has made them for his own purposes, often for a particular display of grace, an opportunity for us to manifest the golden rule and the love of Jesus. And then finally, like the Pharisees, there will be people today who reject the message and who will scorn us as the messengers. And in fact, Jesus promised this in John 15. Or he will, we just haven't got there yet. And there is still an urgency in the message. The night is coming. At the very least, the night of each individual's mortality. When we are alive, we can choose. And after we are dead, there is no more choosing. So, the call is to receive Jesus as the sacrificial Lamb of God, the Messiah, the Savior of mankind, and the King of Kings, while it is yet today.